It's The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. Joining us from London, Nico Hines, world editor of The Daily Beast. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Not so bad. We're here in the studio with Time Magazine's Paris correspondent, Vivian Walt. How's your week been?
Pretty good.
Pretty good, okay. France 24 senior correspondent Catherine Norris-Trent, who took a week off from covering Ukraine to instead cover pension protests.
Yeah, that was pretty good too.
All right. From Jerusalem, France 24 correspondent Iris Makler. It's been a quiet week where you are, right?
Oh, yeah, very quiet.
More on that in a moment. You can listen, like, and subscribe to The World This Week on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and a wide palette of fine streaming services. First, it's finally happened. A Manhattan grand jury handing up a first-ever criminal indictment against a president of the United States, Donald Trump, to be formally fingerprinted next Tuesday over alleged hush money paid to porn star Stormy Daniels. And Vivian Walt, when you look at this story and, of course, the frenzy that surrounds it, the first thing is you think is that Donald Trump's done it again. All the attention on him.
Absolutely. Here we are, speaking about Donald Trump again.
I hope don't turn it into a drinking game. That's
exactly. He is exactly where he wants to be. I would not be surprised if he, made a show of his arraignment on Tuesday instead of going through the underground tunnel that the Manhattan courthouse has. He would like to go past a battery of TV cameras. So, what's crazy about the story is, on the one hand, yes, we can be pleased to see that no one's above the law. On the other hand, this is the most tawdry, kind of low-grade case paying off a porn star $130,000. It's lunch money for Donald Trump.
He's got bigger charges facing him, it seems.
Compared to inciting violence on the U.S. Capitol or trying to overturn the election of a U.S. president, this is really nothing. And it's also 6-7 years old. So, and the other question is, can he really get a conviction? We're talking about a jury trial of 12 people in America who are going to supposedly be neutral on the question of Donald Trump. It seems highly unlikely to me that they would be able to actually convict him.
It's we showed the cover from today's New York Post. Let's show one from last Saturday, and you can see Trump posing with a baseball bat that's directed against the Manhattan DA, who, by the way, is also an elected official. He's a Democrat. Trump seeming to relish the fight with Alvin Bragg, looking like Robert De Niro as Al Capone in The Untouchables there. Nico Hines, Trump relishing the fight, it seems. You heard Vivian Walt speculating on whether he wants to take the front door in next Tuesday. For American media, Daily Beast included, this is great for ratings.
Yeah, the numbers are huge on anything that we run about Donald Trump. I have to confess, we try to rein ourselves in and not run too many Donald Trump stories, even when he says ridiculous things on his Truth Social platform, just like he used to do on Twitter. But it's certainly true that his clicks weren't quite as high running into this presidential campaign as they were back in 2016 when he was running for the first time. And that's why I think this indictment could be so good for him, because it absolutely catapults him back to the top of the news agenda, which he was having to share with Ron DeSantis. And, perhaps now he will become the star of this thing again. If we look at how this is going to possibly play out, there could basically be a jury trial going on in the same year, potentially weeks or months before the presidential election. It doesn't actually matter if he's convicted, because he's not going to go to jail and he can still be elected president even with a conviction under his belt. But it just means that the drama is going to be rolling and rolling and rolling right up until the election come 2024, and I think that's all in his favour.
It's not the U.S. Justice Department that got the first indictment in, but a local prosecutor in Alvin Bragg, who, again, is a Democrat. And that's got Republicans on Capitol Hill gunning for him, with the Speaker of the House of Representatives vowing to, quote, hold Bragg and his unprecedented abuse of power to account, end quote. Even Trump's rivals for the nomination in 2024 are rallying around him on this one.
Well, I think the unprecedented indictment of a former president of the United States on a campaign finance issue is an outrage. And it appears to millions of Americans to be nothing more than a political prosecution that's driven by a prosecutor who literally ran for office on the pledge to indict the former president.
Republicans accusing the justice system of being partisan. Iris Maklar, does that sound familiar?
It sounds very, sorry, it sounds very familiar here. I'm kind of watching in, I don't know, amazement at the United States, because having serious indictments, as Vivian Walt said, having serious indictments at their fingertips, they went for this. But then maybe it's like Al Capone, you get him for what you can get him for. But I hadn't really thought through how much it could possibly help his his presidential campaign. So there's prices to pay for acting and prices to pay for not acting. And I guess that's what we're seeing here too, that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, with charges against him, nevertheless charges, in fact, a court case against him, nevertheless can be in office. He can't be a minister, he can be a prime minister. And I think the country is actually paying a big price for that.
In the U.S., Catherine Norris-Trent, you can run for president from jail. It was seen in 1920. Just to give one example. Your thoughts when you see the most powerful Republican in Congress calling it an abuse of power to indict him and vowing to hold that Manhattan DA to account. Is that just a bit of bluster?
Well, it's certainly making political capital with it. I think it's also extremely dangerous. It sets a big precedent for, trust in all kinds of institutions, including the justice system. It's certainly not good news. And, this whole thing just really plays into the Republicans' hands, and especially Trump's hand. Because if you think about it, he made his political name coming at the 2016 election as the ultimate outsider, the new guy, the one who wasn't part of the swamp. And you can usually only do that once in politics, and then it's gone. We saw that with Emmanuel Macron here in France. He said he was going to blow apart the system, and now he is the system. This has given Trump a second chance of playing that outsider card, and to very powerful effect. So the consequences for the primary, for the election, and for trust in institutions, democracy, the justice system are really profound. I think it's difficult to overstate that.
Yeah, and the focus now is on the potential, as you say, of another Trump versus Biden matchup, and the Republicans falling in line over this issue, certainly. It was a week, though, that Joe Biden got a bunch of new fans, though. We could show you images of a demonstration of support outside the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv. This after the U.S. president lost patience with Israel's prime minister. Benjamin Netanyahu, on the one hand, had pledged to pause a judicial overhaul that's tearing the country apart and triggered a Monday general strike, and on the other, doing nothing to stop the bill from graduating from committee to the floor of the Knesset.
Let me ask about Israel. How concerned are you about the health of democracy there in Israel?
Like many strong supporters of Israel, I'm very concerned. And I'm concerned that they get this straight. They cannot continue down this road. And I've sort of made that clear. Hopefully the Prime Minister will act in a way that he's going to try to work out some genuine compromise, but that remains to be seen.
Are you inviting Prime Minister Netanyahu to the White House, sir? Do you think
No.
he'll be coming to Washington?
Not in the near term.
Iris Makler, that was Tuesday. This is Friday. Are Israelis still stunned by the tone you heard there?
It was a pretty emphatic no, wasn't it? Yeah, I think they are stunned. Depends where you stand, as always, as to what the reaction is. People on the centre and left of politics, if there's a left, people in the centre of politics are very worried because of the primacy of the relationship between Washington, its importance to Israel in every possible way, diplomatic, military, financial, $3.8 billion a year in military aid. Let's just start with that. The support in the United Nations, all those things are vital for Israel, and people here recognise that. On the right side of politics, including up to Benjamin Netanyahu, who tweeted to say that, yes, there's this very strong relationship, historic and so forth, but that Israel's a sovereign nation and it makes its own decisions, even when our good friends abroad don't like it. So leading up to him, there have been much more vicious comments from other people, basically telling Biden where he can go jump. It's quite extraordinary, that, and I think that's also been causing a lot of trouble everywhere else in Israeli politics. But one important thing, there was a discussion, a conversation between Israel's foreign minister and Tony Blinken just yesterday actually, and that was a little more calm, a little more friendly, no mention of no invitations, just agreeing how very important it is to have some dialogue. So perhaps a little olive branch from each side.
That tweet that Iris is mentioning, Vivian Walt, it's written in English. It's written for the international community, presumably for the U.S. president.
Absolutely. This idea that, you can tell the U.S. to, butt out its our country, it really does work with most countries in the world, but not with this one. For the very reason that Iris mentioned, we're talking about billions of dollars in military assistance and assistance of all kind per year. If you look at the rankings of aid to different countries, it is by far the most aid of any country that is given, other than right now Ukraine, obviously. But other than that, it's Israel, number one by far. So you really cannot disentangle these two countries. Israel's existence relies on that assistance. And I think that this is really a kind of a fork in the road. I think that there's going to be really big implications. We're talking about a whole new generation of Americans, Jewish Americans, who are very critical of what's going on in Israel, in a way that maybe their parents or grandparents were not. You have the fading out of a kind of entire generation who had experience of World War II, in which Israel had a kind of moral standing in the world among many people, which maybe is also fading. So I think that there's a lot of profound issues that this raises.
Yeah, and we saw Nico Hines last week when Netanyahu went to London. He didn't meet with the Jewish community because it would have been a perilous exercise.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to look at the differing attitudes of Jewish communities in the US, in the UK. I think that's definitely relevant to this debate, and I think it's very possible that over time that loyalty to Israel could fade, or at least in the sense of people are more willing to raise questions. But I think what's actually more important is looking at the changes to the community in Israel. It's not the US and the UK and the rest of the West that's changing their position. It's Israel that's gone more and more extreme, more and more radical. Demographers suggest that that's partly because the ultra-Orthodox community is growing faster and will become a bigger and bigger voting bloc in Israel. And so therefore we're likely to continue to see, this is not some one-off that we've got these radical, I was going to say crazy and I shrunk, but perhaps some of these people actually are crazy. We've got someone with a conviction for race hatred in the cabinet. I mean, it really is quite extraordinary how far to the right the Israeli parliament has swung. And if we look at those demographic changes, that could continue to swing. And so, yes, there have been some changes in the West, but actually it's the changes in Israel that have been most significant here. And it's true that there's only so much that the White House and Downing Street will take on these things. They won't carry on holding water for Israel forever.
Yeah, the reference there by Nico Heinzkath Nordstrand to Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Home Security Minister, who's one of the concessions that to keep that coalition together is he can have his own National Guard.
That'll calm things down, won't it? I mean, yeah, maybe for the moment that's part of him trying to keep his coalition on board. But if you look at not just these protests and these judicial proposals or judicial overhaul by Netanyahu, look at the violence which has been just ripping through parts of Israel, the West Bank over recent months. It's huge, and something that I don't think will stop, given the way the wind is blowing at the moment and the political formations and the policy of the Israeli government. So I think we're in for a long period of turmoil, which doesn't at all end with Netanyahu suspending these plans. I mean, I don't know who thinks he's kidding on that.
Temporarily suspending. Again, Iris Makler, just to conclude on this, we don't know whether or not that bill is going to come up or not. It hasn't really been formally scrapped. And we also don't know if the defense minister, the one who broke ranks to say that there has to be a pause because of all the reservists refusing to serve, has he been fired or not?
That's a very good question. So he was formally fired, we heard, because we got a message saying so. And then all hell broke loose and we saw those extraordinary protests that were different to anything that had come before on Sunday night after that announcement. Within 24 hours, we heard from the Prime Minister. It took that long. There was a general strike. Planes didn't fly. Ships didn't sail. People didn't go shopping in supermarkets. And then we heard from the Prime Minister that he was going to follow, in fact, the very course that the Defence Minister had suggested. Not pass the legislation immediately, have some dialogue, see if something else couldn't be arrived at by consensus. And since then, he hasn't formally fired the Prime Minister. He hasn't received the papers. So he keeps going to work. The Defence Minister is doing his job. There is someone trying to mediate. And apparently, Netanyahu, the sticking point is that Netanyahu wants him to apologise both for making that statement when Netanyahu was still overseas and also the content of it. And he's prepared to apologise for making the statement when Netanyahu was overseas, but not to apologise for the content. And that's where we're at the moment. So if you ask me, I think he probably will be reinstated, but I couldn't swear to it.
And again, the genesis of all this, is it just Israel becoming a different nation, the dial moving further to the right? Or is it all about one man, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the corruption trial he faces?
It's a little bit of both, because I can't keep saying enough how much this is different to all the other democracies, because there's only one House of Parliament. There's not two houses. There's not state governments. There's no sharing. There's only this one House of Parliament. And so the only break on it is the Supreme Court. And what I keep seeing from all these right-wing parties is, will no one rid me of this meddlesome court? They want control. They say those words, must take back control. Familiar too. And that's what they're going for, to control the court, to be able to get their right-wing agenda and get it through and not be stopped at all. No compromise, not with anyone. And that suits Benjamin Netanyahu right now for personal reasons. So he's allowed something that he hasn't allowed. The Justice Minister who wanted to do this said, when he stood up and said, I've got this great plan for you, guess what I'm going to do? He said, I've wanted to do this for 20 years. Now's my chance. So this is his chance, and Netanyahu is allowing it. And that, I think, is for his own personal reasons, but all the other right-wing, let's not forget what a right-wing government this is, all the other right-wing parties have their own personal reasons for wanting to override the court. So they're taking this chance and they're running at it like bulls in a china shop.
Speaking of legal showdowns, Jair Bolsonaro welcomed home to Brasilia by supporters on Thursday. The former president of Brazil had decamped to Florida before Inauguration Day, and he didn't have to see his successor, Lula, sworn in at the start of the year. Bolsonaro, too, faces a long list of probes, including over his own January 6th-style assault on the Capitol. But it's one case in particular that this week is capturing headlines. Diamonds intercepted at customs in 2021, believed to be for his wife, Michelle. Diamonds from Saudi Arabia. There's supposed to be a court date next Wednesday. Nico Hines, again, it's three leaders, and in all three cases, there's this battle with the courts.
Yeah, nothing says man of the people standing up against the elite like someone complaining that their diamonds were seized. I mean, there's the kind of ridiculous hypocrisy of all of these men, and there are real similarities here that we've got, three kind of people who want to be strong men, who want to suggest that they're being treated unfairly by the elites. And of course, the good news for them is that this is, in some ridiculous way, the fact that they've been caught breaking the law in some ways proves them right, that they are being stopped from doing what they want to do. They are the victims of judicial action. Whether that judicial action, in fact, is legitimate, probably, arguably, in all of three cases, kind of is beside the point, because they can make the point to their supporters, hey, look, I'm being abused, you need to stand up with me. So in some ways, I think there's a slight difference in Brazil, which is that you're not allowed to run for president if you're convicted. So Lula was only able to run and win because his conviction was overturned, although it won't be lost on anyone that he was in jail for most of the previous Bolsonaro term, came out just in time to be swept back into power, proving that these sorts of court cases aren't necessarily a bar to future electoral success.
And Vivian Walt, this harks back to what Catherine Norris-Trent was saying earlier about these are tests for liberal democracies.
Absolutely, and you don't have to understand a word of Portuguese to, recognize in Bolsonaro just it mirrors so much of what is happening with Trump. I mean, of course, he mirrored his leadership very much after Trump. So, the very fact that he went off to Florida after his defeat, and that he was, complaining about the election results and so on. I mean, it is so remarkably similar to what's happening with Trump. And I think that perhaps less so than the U.S., will it be a test for the judicial system? I think Trump is going to test the judicial system in the U.S. to its extremes.
Bolsonaro, though, returning at a time when the new president's popularity is going down.
Absolutely. He is arriving back potentially as a kind of, sweeping back as, as Nico says, the man of the people, and to, reclaim some kind of order and, let's get the country back on track. And again, very much like Donald Trump, of course. I kind of have some doubts about whether or not it's going to work. Brazil is a very big country, and Lula's presidency is very new, this presidency. And I think that we'll have to see whether or not Bolsonaro has any traction, whether or not these judicial charges stick.
All right. The U.S. With tests to democracies at home and in its backyard, the Biden administration has another crisis on its hand to work on. Thursday's arrest in Yekaterinburg of Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who, according to friends, was following a story on the mercenaries of the Wagner Group. The 31-year-old Gershkovich charged with espionage, a first for a U.S. Journalist since the end of the Cold War.
This is the prerogative of the FSB. You already had a statement about this from the Federal Security Service. We have nothing to add. The only thing I can add is, as far as we know, he was caught red-handed.
I wasn't allowed into the hearing. I contacted the Office for Criminal Cases, but they told me they didn't have this case. They've pulled the stunt many times. I can't say anything because I haven't seen the notice on charges filed against him, but I know for sure that my client would only be acting legally.
Catherine Norris-Trent, we can only guess what it's about, really, this story. But there's a question of the timing, right? Why now?
Well, why now? Yeah, perhaps Putin's in a bad spot trying to put even more pressure on Biden. I mean, if you look at the record of this journalist who worked for the Wall Street Journal, his colleagues in Moscow and in the US, speak about a very conscientious, professional guy. He worked for Agence France Presse. He lived out there for 6 years. All his colleagues expressing horror, saying that this is just completely incredible. So, yeah, we can only guess at what it's about. We have to wait for details, but it looks very political.
Because people talk about a prisoner swap, that that he would be fodder for some prisoner swap, another one like the one we saw with the basketball player, Brittany Griner. But there's also the other aspect, which is this is an American journalist. And Vladimir Putin has gone to great lengths to paint this as a war not with Ukraine, but between superpowers.
Absolutely. I think that's definitely the message he's trying to get across, that the Americans, he says, have their hand in Ukraine. The Americans are managing this. We caught this American man, the Kremlin says, spying. So, yeah, this is feeding into this Cold War narrative. An American hasn't been arrested like this on espionage charges since the Cold War. So that is the message he's trying to get across. That's a very clear communication. And presumably the Russians will be using this for some kind of hostage exchange. So, yeah, those two motivations would be my main guess.
When the Daily Beast's Alison Quinn contacted Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin Thursday for a reaction, she got a bit of Gallows humor on her voicemail. Quote, "Dear Alison baby, you are asking too many questions today. I'm busy searching my garden plot for the corpse of your colleague, and you are asking me about some new events." End quote. Nico Hines, what was the reaction among colleagues to this?
Well, it's a kind of mixture of bemusement. There were, journalists are famous for one thing, which is a dark sense of humour, and so everybody was laughing and joking about this and how Alison had caught Prigozhin's eye somehow. But there's also a very serious element to it. Prigozhin is one of the most feared and nasty kind of killers in charge of a private militia roaming the face of the planet right now, with all sorts of assassins and hit squads, and the willingness to do awful things to people, as he has been so busily promoting himself with these kind of grim videos that Wagner put out of people having their heads smashed by giant hammers, and so while we laugh, it's actually an incredibly serious and unpleasant situation. And if I was Evan and Evan's family, I would not be laughing at all, because he is now going to be in a Russian prison probably for at least 6 months, if not a year, before any of these sort of so-called prison swaps are able to take place. And who knows, it could be even worse. He could be stuck in one of these places for years and years and years, penal colonies, and a lot of people don't come out of those alive. Evan was based here in London. By all accounts, he was a really sweet, lovely, kind and determined and principled guy, a very good five-a-side footballer, I've heard, and a really, really sweet man who does not deserve the fate of the awful Russian prison system.
Lots of reactions on the hashtag world this week. Iris Makler, one of them, Putin is just getting some bargaining chips.
Look, that could be right. You know, professional hostage taking, such as we see from Russia and from Iran, always has a purpose, and it is a bargaining chip. And poor Evan for being that bargaining chip, you know, because I don't think he's going to die in a Russian jail, but he's going to be there a while, and it's not going to be an easy haul for him. And I know that a Russian media site is inviting people to write letters to him, which I think I'm going to do. Actually, I used to be based in Moscow, and I want to say that to him and encourage him a little, because he, you know, it's all you've got in prison is when people from the outside write in to you and show their support for you. So I feel as someone who was based in Moscow myself, and I have been looking. There was someone who was with me then and who is still there now. So Steve Rosenberg has done 20 years for the BBC there, and I was just looking at one of his last reports recently and thinking, wow, how long will he be able to stay there? And I have seen calls for all Americans, that is, and especially American reporters, to leave. Is that where we're at now? Is it really back to pre-Cold War? Is it really like Stalin's time where you actually can't come in as a foreigner without the risk of being kidnapped?
Vivian Walt?
Look, I think, you know, firstly, what Nico says, Evan is in just a horrendous, a nightmare situation. I cannot imagine what he's going through. But the other thing is what it does for the coverage of Russia. Here you have, you know, a major country at war in Europe. We have been really lucky this past year to have had some very good journalists in Moscow, including him. And in fact, the very day before he was picked up, there was this front page story on the Wall Street Journal about how Russia's economy was on its knees. And here you have somebody who's deeply sourced in Russia. He speaks the language. He knows how to get around. He can dig into things, and he very cleverly kind of outlined exactly how Russia's economy was falling apart. And here he was about to clearly report a story about the real cost of the war, the human toll of the war, the kinds of stories that the Kremlin does not want told, and the kind of stories that really desperately need to be told by people who can operate in Moscow. If I was a journalist in Moscow right now, I, of course, would be headed to the airport and getting on the first plane out of there. I don't think anybody from the Western media is safe anymore in Moscow, and that's going to be a huge loss to our understanding, our insights of what's going on.
Moving on, it should have been Versailles, but due to a spot of industrial action here, Charles III's first state visit as king, instead the next country on the list, Germany. Charles showing his green credentials by making the trip from Berlin to Hamburg this Friday by train. The new monarch also visited an organic farm on Thursday where he made political hay, or in this case, cheese, with Germany's president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier. By speaking the language of Goethe before Parliament, it was also a nod to his family's German roots and to his prime minister's bid to turn the page on Brexit frictions in the face of common challenges.
The security of Europe has been threatened, and our democratic values threatened. Yet the world has not merely stood by. Even as we abhor the appalling scenes of destruction, we can take heart in our unity.
Catherine North-Strand, listening to now King Charles speaking German, what was your reaction there?
Well, I was just thinking, I bet he wouldn't have had it down as his first country for a state visit, nor would anyone else. I mean, the royal family has been very keen to kind of get Commonwealth countries back on track. So I think they would have gone down that route. And apparently the British government stepped in and said, look, can you visit France and Germany, make this a European tour? And then, of course, the French leg was cancelled, very embarrassingly, because of the protests, the riots, the political crisis here. And so he just found himself just going to Germany. So it was really rather odd, even though it is perhaps a chance for him to look up some family or old friends, because they do have very German roots, it seems like a slightly odd choice. And he didn't mention Brexit once, by the way, during that speech to the Bundestag. He didn't mention the EU. He was very diplomatic. But clearly, this was a diplomatic choice by the British government to use Charles as a diplomatic tool to, well, get European relations back on track.
Iris Makler, in places like Australia, were they miffed that the Commonwealth was not first on the list?
I don't know about that. I can see why the wanting to get the Commonwealth back on track, but there's also a move within Australia perhaps to move away from the Commonwealth to become a republic. There's all of that undertow to this, so I don't think they would feel, nose out of joint. And wasn't it interesting to see him speaking actually quite good German? And I read a very moving piece by a historian who lives in Hamburg, saying that him coming there, laying a wreath at the St. Nikolai Church, what it means to link the two histories, and he did mention the war, and by going there, where he's actually been before, that it was really reaching out a hand, both in historic terms and in today's terms, and that it was very touching for the Germans.
Nico Hines, when the Queen died last September, we all talked about the fact that we know King Charles. We've known Charles for decades. He's a familiar face. Is it still a surprise, though, now to see him as monarch?
Yeah, I guess it is. It's certainly, there'll be all sorts of changes coming that people will find hard to get used to when his face starts appearing on the money and the stamps and all of that kind of thing, because the Queen was always held in such high esteem over here. And I think the fact is Charles just doesn't have that sort of level of respect across the spectrum. It's very interesting that he has been on these political issues. I know he would argue that it's not political to talk about net zero and climate change because he thinks that these are essential issues that have to be tackled. But the sad fact is that they are political issues. And I think Charles's willingness to speak out on issues that he feels strongly about are brave, bold, and ultimately are going to be very dangerous for the monarchy, because the great thing about the Queen was that she never said anything that offended anybody or annoyed anybody in any way. She was entirely anodyne in the best tradition of the royal family. And so it's very interesting to see Charles positioning himself as somebody with issues that he wants to fight for. I fear that that's not necessarily in the best interest of the monarchy long term.
All right, we shall see as that develops. Now, about those protests here in France that we mentioned, attendance this week, give you a little update, down slightly, the latest National Day of Action on Tuesday. A garbage strike in Paris has now been suspended. There's an offer of dialogue and an April 14th date set for the Constitutional Council to rule whether or not this bid by Emmanuel Macron's government to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64 is legal. Is it calming down, Vivian Walt?
Yeah, sorry.
Is it calming down here in France?
Oh, it certainly feels like that. Or maybe not exactly calming down, but taking a little bit of a breather. I think people are kind of exhausted. I think on both sides, people are simply sort of strung out after the past couple of months. I think what's so interesting and maybe baffling is how President Macron seems to have completely bungled the messaging of all of this. He simply, from beginning to end, has not had any kind of grasp on how to bring the country together, how to get the country out. He's behaved as if he's sort of paralyzed. And to think of like how his presidency began, I found it kind of very confusing.
Yeah, well, we did see an attempt by the president this week for a return to normal. Catherine Norris-Trent. He embarked Thursday on his first public outing in more than a month, a destination, the Alps, where he unveiled the government's plan on saving water. Pension reform protesters were kept at bay. Is Macron, can he roll with the punches on this one?
I'm really not sure that he can. I mean, he went on this trip to the provinces basically to show that he's not stuck in some kind of bunker in Paris, because it's really got so personal about Macron that how is he going to try and do his job for the next 4 years? He was elected not even a year ago. So it's extremely personal. Things have got extremely nasty. He's managed to divide France in a way which is pretty spectacular, as Vivienne was saying, given the way in which he was, the promise on which he was elected. And the worrying thing for me is it's not even about how he's going to govern the next 4 years, what's going to happen after that, because Macron kind of partly destroyed the left and the right, mainstream right of French politics, destroyed everything in his track, bulldozed through the middle as this new centrist hope. A lot of people are very disappointed and disillusioned and angry, frankly, with his government. And so what comes next? The extremes? And it is really worrying, I think, for the future of France.
And a lot of the focus, both domestically and abroad, has been on the violence. One protester still in a coma from a fractured skull. That's after an unrelated rally by environmentalists that took place last Saturday against the building of a giant water storage tank in the southwest of France. Here you see a protest in the southwest. They were met with an overwhelming police presence, according to leaked audio recording between doctors and a dispatcher. Orders were given not to allow emergency services to the scene as anger over riot police tactics, particularly the use of motorbikes in cities and quad bikes at last Saturday's demonstration. Catherine, you covered the big demonstration for us in Paris on Tuesday. What was the level of violence like?
So I think the police were deliberately holding back, the riot police, because the previous Thursday there'd been these extraordinary scenes of violence which had gone all around the planet, giving a terrible image. So yeah, you had rioters and people breaking shop fronts and setting fire to bins, but you also had the French riot police using extremely heavy-handed tactics and use of force, of using their batons. Amnesty International put out a report saying they were concerned about the French policing tactics, and those videos are viral on social media. So on Tuesday, there was a bit of tear gas, a bit of charging towards the end. They were trying to disperse the crowds, I guess, to try and prevent it becoming a night time of protests. They were holding back from the previous week, and those scenes which were extremely shocking and which were getting more and more people involved in the protests. Young people I spoke to on the street said they'd only come out for the first time because they were absolutely disgusted at the use of force and those environmental protests and the crackdown on that. And they were saying, you know, this is very simple for a lot of people to understand. We cannot live in this, what they were describing as a police state. So I think they had to hold back, and they did hold back to some extent. Big questions asked about French policing tactics, though.
For French policing tactics, and I know that those questions are being asked abroad, particularly since the Champions League final that took place in Paris last spring. One final point, and that is that after last year's run on mustard, blamed on a bad crop for mustard seeds from Canada, now comes the great Perrier shortage of 2023. The famed French sparkling water owned by Nestle comes from one single source that's in the south of the country, and it's prone to drought. And we've had bad droughts in France and Italy. There's also a shortage, by the way, of bubbles, or more precisely, the carbon dioxide made from organic fertilizer. Le Figaro newspaper reporting that with the war in Ukraine, fertilizer prices exploded, so manufacturers stopped producing it. That's what the general manager of the supplier of the CO2 says. Iris Makler, not enough Perrier in the stores, and we're back to talking about the war in Ukraine?
It's funny, isn't it? I've got a rule of threes. A big crisis, three things have to go wrong simultaneously. This is only a shortage, so two things are going wrong simultaneously. And it's interesting, not only that we're talking about the war in Ukraine, who knew that the bubbles in water came from fertilizer? I naively thought this was actually how it came out of the ground. So I've learnt a lot from the great Perrier shortage of 2023.
All right. Well, hopefully it's a temporary one. Iris, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Jerusalem. I want to thank Nico Hines in London, Vivienne Waltz, Catherine Norris-Trent. Thank you for being with us here in The World This Week.